James moved silently through the gleaming corridors of the 42nd floor, his mop gliding over the pristine marble like a forgotten shadow. It was just after 5 a.m., and the towering glass skyscraper hadn't yet come alive with the morning rush. In the quiet, James found his rhythm cleaning floors most people never noticed, scrubbing corners no one cared to see, but he did it with care, with purpose. Every swipe was for his 8-year-old son, Liam, who was asleep 3 miles away, in a hospital bed, recovering from another heart procedure they couldn't afford. He hadn't always been a janitor. James once worked at a small IT firm, dreamed big, and had a wife who laughed like sunshine. But after the accident took her, and Liam's medical needs grew heavier than his dreams, James swallowed his pride. This job came with health insurance. That was enough. Each night, while others rested, James worked, praying for one more day with Liam, one more hour without the hospital calling with bad news. The top floor always made him uneasy. The air felt sharper here, heavier with power. This was where million-dollar suits decided fates with the flick of a pen. James knew his place was outside those doors. He was the invisible man, his presence acknowledged only when needed, his absence barely noticed. On this particular morning, the glass-walled boardroom flickered with light and tension. Inside, men and women in tailored suits surrounded a long table, deep in heated debate. Papers were being shuffled, voices were raised, and a large digital display blinked. Final review, Global Edge acquisition, $3 billion. James had heard whispers over the past week. If this deal went through, thousands of jobs would be lost. Manufacturing plants would be shut down. Real people like him would be thrown into chaos. He paused outside the room, cloth in hand, and glanced through the glass. The CEO, a tall, graying man named Mr. Dalton, looked tired but determined as he stood at the head of the table. We finalize this today, Dalton declared. The board expects a vote. It's our biggest opportunity. Yet, a younger executive hesitated. And the layoffs? Collateral, another board member replied coldly. They'll understand. It's business. James felt his heart sink. Collateral, that word so casually thrown, felt like a punch. He wasn't part of this world, but he knew what losing a job meant, especially for those already on the edge. He stood still, cloth tightening in his grip. He knew he shouldn't speak. He was just the janitor. But sometimes silence is the real crime. As the door opened and Mr. Dalton stepped out. Momentarily alone, James did something he'd never dared to do. He leaned slightly forward and whispered, barely audible, "Sir, don't sign that deal. It'll break more lives than it builds." Dalton stopped mid-stride, startled. He turned and looked at James as if seeing him for the first time, not the uniform, not the mop but the man. There was something raw and unfiltered in James's eyes. No agenda, no pitch, just truth. For a moment the corridor held its breath. Dalton didn't reply. He nodded faintly, almost imperceptibly, and walked back into the boardroom. James, heart pounding, resumed cleaning, expecting nothing but regret. But 10 minutes later, a storm broke behind those glass doors. What do you mean you're pulling out? One executive barked. Dalton stood firm. I'm saying we're not doing this. Not like this. We're better than this. But this is business. Another argued. Dalton looked toward the glass door where James had been, now empty, just freshly polished tile reflecting fluorescent light. Exactly, Dalton said quietly, which is why it has to start being human. And just like that, the $3 billion deal was dead. James had no idea what he had changed until later, but in that moment, with mop in hand and hope in his chest, he reminded one of the most powerful men in the city that even a whisper can change the course of giants. The hallway outside the boardroom pulsed with tension. Even through its polished silence, James had just finished wiping down the last fingerprints smudged on the glass walls, when he caught a snippet of the conversation drifting through the barely open door. They won't survive the restructuring. Entire branches will be gone by Q2. They're hourly, they'll bounce back. We can't babysit the bottom rung. The words hit James like a slap. Bottom rung. Babysit. He wasn't supposed to listen, wasn't supposed to exist in their world, but those words weren't just strategy or spreadsheets. They were lives. They were single moms, aging fathers, and yes, janitors like him who worked 2 jobs to keep a sick child breathing. These weren't numbers. These were people. He froze, gripping his cleaning cloth, heart pounding. This deal would destroy families, quiet, struggling ones like his. But what could he do? He was invisible here. Just a ghost between marble tiles and boardroom walls. Yet something stirred inside him. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe desperation, or maybe, just maybe, it was courage born from having nothing left to lose. Asterisk as the boardroom door swung open and the CEO stepped out. Eyes fixed ahead, James stepped forward, just slightly, only enough to be noticed, and let the words slip from his mouth before he could take them back. Asterisk, sir, ... Don't sign that deal. It'll break more lives than it builds. Asterisk, it wasn't loud. It wasn't practiced. Just a whisper. But it stopped everything. Mr. Dalton halted mid-step. The hallway, the boardroom, the world, it all seemed to pause. His eyes met James's. There was a flicker of confusion, then recognition. The CEO looked into the tired face of a man he must have passed 100 times without a second glance. But now he looked at him, truly. Asterisk behind him, the murmur of voices in the boardroom died down. Someone had heard the whisper too. Everyone was waiting for Dalton to speak, to scoff, to move on, but he didn't. He simply stood there, silence thick between them. And in that silence, something passed, something quiet, human, and real. Asterisk then, without a word, Dalton turned around and walked back into the room. Asterisk the glass door closed behind him. James stood frozen, his breath shallow, his fingers trembling, slightly. Maybe he had just cost himself his job. Maybe they'd laugh, maybe he'd disappear like always, but something was different this time, because in a hallway built for power, a janitor's whisper had just cut through it like thunder. Asterisk. The tension inside the boardroom was thick enough to slice with a knife. Suits leaned forward, pens ready, eyes on the final contract lying open at the center of the long glass table. Everything had led to this moment, months of negotiation, sleepless nights, and a promise of a $3 billion win. Asterisk. But when CEO Richard Dalton walked back in, something in him had shifted. Asterisk. He didn't return to his seat. He didn't glance at the papers. Instead, he strode to the head of the table, looked each board member in the eye, and with a calmness that made the room go still, he slammed the folder shut. Gasps and murmurs rippled around the table. "We're not signing this," Dalton said, his voice low but firm. Asterisk. A young executive blinked. "Excuse me." Asterisk. "This deal's off," Dalton repeated. "We're not crushing people to grow profits." Asterisk. The CFO's pen clattered against the table. "Richard, do you understand the scope of what you're doing? This acquisition is projected to increase revenue by asterisk. I've read every projection, and every one of them assumes we treat human lives like spreadsheet errors." Silence. Another board member leaned in. "With all due respect, this is a business decision. We have a fiduciary responsibility, asterisk, and I have a conscience." Dalton cut in. "That used to mean something here." Asterisk. The room was stunned. Faces that had grown used to calculated ambition now wore expressions of confusion and disbelief. "This wasn't in the script." Asterisk. Finally, the senior vice president scoffed. "What even brought this on?" Asterisk. Dalton paused. Then, slowly, he lifted a hand and pointed toward the glass door at the far end of the boardroom. All heads turned. There, just beyond the door, stood James. His mop leaned against the wall, and he stood half in shadow, half in panic. He hadn't meant to stay. He should have kept moving, but something told him to watch just for a second. Asterisk. "That man," Dalton said quietly. "He reminded me of something I forgot." Asterisk. James's heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to look away, to vanish like he always did. But this time, he stood still. Asterisk. Back inside the room, no one spoke. The deal, they thought, was certain, now lay dead beneath Dalton's hand. Not because of a legal flaw, not because of a financial risk, asterisk, but because a janitor dared to care, and a CEO finally remembered how to listen. Asterisk. In that moment, the balance of power didn't tilt toward money or metrics. It bowed quietly and unexpectedly to truth. Asterisk. The next morning, James walked into the building expecting silence or worse. Maybe security would be waiting, maybe a pink slip. After all, janitors didn't speak up in boardrooms, not in buildings like this, not in worlds like that. Asterisk. But instead of a warning, he was handed a note from the front desk. Asterisk. "Mr. Dalton would like to see you. 9 a.m. office for 3A." Asterisk. James stared at the paper, stunned. His hands, calloused and dry from nights of cleaning, trembled slightly as he folded it and tucked it into his pocket. Asterisk. At 9 o'clock sharp, he knocked on the CEO's heavy oak door, heart racing. Asterisk. "Come." In came the familiar voice. Asterisk. Inside, Dalton's office was nothing like James imagined. It wasn't cold or overwhelming. It was simple, with shelves of worn books and photos of family. A single picture of a boy playing soccer sat framed on the desk. Faded, but cherished. James, Dalton greeted, standing up to shake his hand. Thanks for coming. James shifted uncomfortably. Sir, if this is about yesterday, I didn't mean to overstep. I know I was out of line. Dalton waved him off gently. You weren't out of line. You were the only one in line. The rest of us lost sight of it. James looked confused. The room felt too quiet, too still. I used to be like you, Dalton continued, motioning for him to sit. Not a janitor, but someone who remembered names, stories, people. Somewhere along the climb, I lost that yesterday. You reminded me. James swallowed hard. I didn't mean to make a scene. I just heard what they were saying. People like me don't get second chances when deals like that happen. Dalton leaned forward. Tell me about your son. James hesitated. Then, with a breath, he opened up about Liam's first surgery at age 3, about losing his wife to a drunk driver just 2 years later, about the night shifts, the skipped meals, the exhaustion that never quite left. He didn't cry. He'd forgotten how. But Dalton listened, really listened. By the end, the CEO's expression had softened completely. The boardroom mask was gone. All that remained was a man. You reminded me who I used to be, Dalton said softly, and what this company needs to become again. James looked down, unsure what to say. Then came the offer, simple, but life-altering. I want you to take a new position, Dalton said. Employee relations. You'll help us hear the voices we've ignored. Be the person who listens, like you did for me. James blinked. I'm just a janitor. Dalton smiled. Not anymore. You're the reason this company just found its soul again. In that quiet office, with sunlight slipping through tall windows, father became something more than a worker. He became a bridge between the boardroom and the break room, between power and people. And for the first time in years, James walked out of work, not just tired, but proud. A soft breeze rustled the banners lining the courtyard, each one bearing the new company motto, people first, always. Employees gathered beneath a white tent, smiling, clapping, their faces alight with something rare in the corporate world, genuine pride. It had been a year since that fateful morning, a year since a janitor's whisper stopped a $3 billion deal and started something even greater. But company, once rigid and profit-obsessed, had transformed. Layoffs were replaced with support programs. Wages were re-evaluated. Family leave expanded. Leadership began hosting monthly floor talks to hear voices that once echoed unheard in back halls and locker rooms. Now, at the company's first annual Heart of the Company event, all eyes were on a simple podium at the front, and standing behind it, nervous suits slightly oversized, hands trembling just enough to be real, was James. The applause rolled like thunder. In the front row, Liam sat upright in a folding chair, his face glowing with quiet joy. No foretubes, no hospital bracelet, just a boy, beaming at his father, alive and well. CEO Richard Dalton stepped up beside James and placed a hand on his shoulder. Most of you know this man as James, he said, voice steady, but to me, he's the man who reminded us that business should never forget its heart. The crowd hushed. Dalton continued. When we were ready to trade people for profits, James reminded us that leadership is about listening even to whispers, especially to whispers. James stepped forward. He cleared his throat, scanning. The room filled with executives, assistants, technicians, and janitors alike. I never thought I'd speak at something like this, he began, his voice rough but warm. A year ago, I was just trying to keep my son alive. I didn't come here to make a point, I just couldn't stay quiet anymore. He looked at Liam, then back to the crowd. I didn't save this company. You did. Every one of you who showed up, who cared, who chose kindness over convenience. We did this together. Tears welled in more than a few eyes. I used to think a whisper couldn't matter, James finished. But it turns out, sometimes a whisper is all it takes to wake up a sleeping giant. The crowd rose in a standing ovation, not for a CEO or a quarterly report, but for a father, for a man with a mop and a voice, for a moment of truth that had become a legacy. And as James stepped down from the podium, into his son's arms and into a future filled not just with hope, but with purpose, the message echoed far beyond the company walls. A single act of courage, no matter how small, can rewrite the story of an entire world.